The ICU at Sonoran Wildlife Rescue never really slept. Even at night, the building breathed soft mechanical exhales from air filters, the distant hum of refrigeration units, the steady electronic pulse of machines built to keep fragile lives tethered to the present. At 2:13 a.m., the overhead lights were dimmed to a warm amber, gentle enough not to sting exhausted eyes, bright enough to reveal what no one wanted to say out loud. Inside a temperature-controlled incubator lay a lion cub named Asher. He was smaller than people expected a lion cub to be. Too small. His ribs rose faintly beneath a thin golden coat, every breath shallow as if his body had already begun rationing air. A tiny paw twitched once, then went still. The monitor beside him traced a line that dipped, corrected itself, then dipped again. Never alarming enough to trigger a full alert, but never strong enough to offer comfort. On the other side of the glass stood Dr. Mason Cole, arms folded, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on those numbers. Mason had learned long ago not to touch the glass when he felt helpless. Touching made it personal. And this was already too personal. "Heart rate's dropping again," Jordan Price said quietly from behind him. Jordan's voice carried the tired restraint of someone on a third overnight shift in a row, someone who had already seen more endings than beginnings this week. "Not crashing," Jordan added, "just slipping." Mason didn't turn. "I know." His voice came out calm, almost clinical, but his jaw tightened just enough to betray him. "He's not fighting," Jordan said. Mason stared at the cub, at the barely there rise and fall of his chest. "No," he murmured. "He's not." They stood in silence, watching a life decide inch by inch whether it was worth holding on. Asher had arrived less than 12 hours earlier, wrapped in a thermal blanket and dusted with pale red grit from the Arizona desert. Confiscated from an illegal private menagerie, the report said. The lioness had panicked during transport, thrashing against steel bars until she bled. When it was over, she refused her cub. Nature's logic, the field notes called it. A stressed mother, limited resources, instinctual abandonment. Mason had read that sentence 100 times in his career. It never got easier. Behind them, the door at the end of the corridor opened with a soft click. Footsteps, measured, deliberate, approached. Evelyn Hart, the center's director, stopped beside Mason, clipboard tucked under her arm, silver hair pulled into its usual tight knot. Without the armor of meetings and authority, she looked older, tired in a way sleep didn't fix. "Any change?" she asked. Mason shook his head once. "He's stable," Mason said. Then after a beat, he added, "But he's not present." Evelyn followed his gaze to the incubator. For a long moment, she said nothing. The monitor beeped softly, as if filling the space between them. "We've done everything by protocol," she said finally. "Warmth, fluids, nutrition attempts, minimal handling. This isn't negligence." "I know," Mason replied. Then he lowered his voice. "This isn't medical." Evelyn's eyes flicked to him. Caution lived in that glance. "He's refusing," Mason said. Refusing what she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Mason didn't look away from the cub. Not the formula, not the syringe, not the feeding tube. He swallowed life. Evelyn exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. "You're anthropomorphizing." "Am I?" Mason finally turned to face her. "Because I've seen this before." Evelyn didn't ask where. Everyone at Sonoran knew Mason's history, former emergency responder, military medic before that. A man who had left human trauma behind to work with animals, believing foolishly maybe that it would hurt less. She'd hired him because he was good. She'd kept him because he was careful. And because he understood loss without making it someone else's burden. "This isn't the place for experiments," Evelyn said, firm, but not unkind. "If his condition deteriorates further, we'll have to consider humane options." The words hung between them, heavy and exact. Mason nodded once. "Understood." Evelyn gave Asher one last look through the glass, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Jordan shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Mason?" Mason rubbed a hand over his face. The skin beneath his eyes burned with exhaustion, but he stayed where he was, staring into the incubator, like the answer might suddenly appear if he watched long enough. Jordan hesitated, then spoke again carefully this time. There's something he said, down in intake. Mason didn't respond. A puppy came in late last night, Jordan continued. Surrender, deaf. Family said they couldn't manage the costs. He's different. That made Mason turn. Different how? Jordan chose his words like he was stepping across thin ice. He doesn't react to noise, doesn't flinch, doesn't scare easy. Jordan's gaze flicked to the incubator, to the cub's turned-away face. He just presses up against anything warm. People, towels, other animals. Mason looked back at Asher, at the way the cub had curled inward, face angled toward the corner of the incubator, like he was trying to make himself smaller than he already was. Bring him, Mason said. Jordan blinked. Bring him, Mason repeated, voice low and steady. In a carrier. We keep a barrier. Full safety measures. Jordan stared at him. That's against protocol. So is standing here while he fades because we're afraid to try, Mason replied. For a moment, neither man moved. The monitor traced another shallow dip. Jordan swallowed. If Evelyn finds out, I'll take it, Mason said immediately. All of it. Jordan's jaw flexed. Then he nodded once and turned on his heel, jogging down the corridor toward intake. Mason stayed where he was, eyes locked on the small golden body in the incubator. He thought of a different room years ago. Machines making the same sounds, fluorescent lights, staining everything. The color of fatigue. He remembered a heartbeat line flattening while everyone pretended it wasn't happening yet. Mason leaned closer to the glass, lowering his voice even though Asher couldn't understand the words. Just stay, he murmured. Give me one reason. At 2:13 a.m., the ICU door clicked open again. Jordan stepped inside, carrying a small carrier. Inside it, a golden retriever puppy shifted clumsily, dark eyes, bright tail thumping against plastic. He didn't startle at the lights, didn't react to the machines. He simply pressed his nose against the carrier door, curious and unafraid. Mason watched the puppy like he was watching a match being struck in a room full of gasoline. If he can't hear fear, Mason said quietly, almost to himself, maybe all he'll notice is loneliness. Jordan set the carrier down beside the incubator. His hand hovered over the latch. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Jordan didn't open the carrier right away. He set it beside the incubator and looked at Mason, waiting for one last chance for someone to say, stop, to restore the comfort of rules and procedures that made sense on paper. Inside the carrier, the puppy shifted his weight. His nose fogged the clear plastic as he sniffed the unfamiliar air. His tail thumped against the base in an uneven rhythm like a heartbeat that didn't know it was being measured. Mason gave one controlled nod. Barrier stays in place, he said. We watch everything. Jordan's fingers found the latch. He released it. The carrier door swung open with a muted click, and the puppy tumbled forward, paws sliding awkwardly on the smooth ICU floor. He didn't hesitate. He didn't scan the room. He didn't freeze at the sight of the incubator. He simply padded ahead, guided by warmth rather than caution, until he reached the padded divider separating him from Asher's enclosure. The puppy sat head tilted, studying the small golden shape curled inside the incubator. His tail slowed, then stilled as if he'd sensed something fragile. He leaned forward and pressed his side against the divider nose, resting where the warmth was strongest. Then he lowered himself fully to the floor, curling naturally toward the heat like it belonged to him. Mason watched from the foot of the incubator, arms crossed tight against his chest. He told himself he was observing, not hoping. Hope had a way of making people reckless. He'd learned that in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and regret. Nothing happened. Jordan glanced at the monitor, then at Mason. No change. Not yet, Mason replied. Minutes crawled by, 5, 10. The room seemed to shrink around them. Every sound amplified the faint hum of the incubator fan, the whisper of air through vents, the distant clang of a door somewhere deeper in the facility. Outside, the desert night pressed against the walls, cool and indifferent, unaware that a decision was being tested inside its borders. Then Asher stirred. It was subtle, just a tremor beneath the thin coat, like wind passing through tall grass. His paw twitched once, then again. Jordan inhaled sharply. Did you? I saw Mason said already, leaning forward. Asher's head shifted a fraction of an inch. One ear flicked not toward sound because there was none, but toward sensation. toward the steady, unfamiliar warmth pressed against the divider. The puppy lifted his head, sensing the movement. He scooted closer, nose nudging the padded barrier. Without hesitation, he licked it once, twice, tongue leaving faint streaks on the surface. Asher flinched. The monitor blipped. The line spiked just enough to pull air back into Mason's lungs. Asher's eyelids fluttered heavy as if waking from a dream he hadn't wanted to leave. For a moment his eyes opened dark, unfocused, searching. They didn't find a threat. They found another living thing. Asher's gaze fixed on the blur of gold just beyond the barrier. His breathing deepened, the shallow gasp smoothing into something closer to rhythm. He didn't lift his head. He didn't cry out, but he didn't turn away either. Mason felt his shoulders drop, tension draining from muscles he hadn't realized were clenched. "He's orienting," Mason murmured. Jordan swallowed hard. "He's staying." It was the first choice Asher had made since arriving at Sonoran. The puppy settled again, content to lie where he was, eyes half closed. He had no idea he was crossing a line most species never did. He only knew something small and alone was nearby, and that being close felt right. Mason straightened slowly. "We keep it controlled," he said. "Short intervals. Document everything." Jordan nodded, but his eyes stayed on the incubator like he was afraid to blink. "Evelyn's going to lose it," Jordan muttered. "Evelyn isn't here," Mason replied. Then, after a beat, "Not yet." They stood in a quiet, shared disbelief as the unlikely pairing breathed in sync, one fighting to stay, the other unaware. He'd been invited into a battle at all. When the shift changed at dawn, Mason didn't leave. He stayed through morning rounds, through whispered conversations and careful glances that followed him down the corridor like shadows. By mid-morning, Dr. Lila Chen arrived with a tablet tucked under her arm and skepticism written plainly across her face. She stopped short at the sight of the puppy curled beside the incubator. "What am I looking at?" she asked. Mason didn't flinch. "A variable." Lila's eyebrow lifted. "That's a dog." "Yes." "And that," she said, pointing toward the incubator, "is a lion." "Yes." She stepped closer, scanning the monitor readouts, the charts, the subtle changes in breathing. Her expression shifted not to belief but to curiosity. "Vitals are improved," she said. "Marginally, but improved." Since 2:13 a.m., Mason confirmed. Lila exhaled slowly. "Correlation isn't causation." "Then explain why his cortisol dropped the moment the puppy arrived," Mason said. Lila didn't answer right away. She stared at the data longer than she needed to. Patterns didn't care about pride. An hour later, the ICU door opened again. Evelyn Hart stepped in. Her gaze took in the room in one sharp sweep, the puppy, the incubator, the numbers on the screen. Her mouth tightened. "Explain." Mason did, calmly and completely. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He laid out the facts, the risk, and the responsibility he was willing to carry. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at Asher, at the way the cub's breathing had evened out, at the way his body once turned inward, now angled subtly toward the warmth beside him. "This is temporary," Evelyn said at last. "You understand that?" Mason nodded. "Yes." "You get 48 hours, Evelyn continued. "If there's no significant improvement, we stop. No exceptions." Jordan's face went pale. Lila went still. Mason only said, "Understood." Evelyn turned to leave, then paused at the door. "What's the dog's name?" Jordan hesitated. He didn't come with one. Evelyn looked back at the puppy, who chose that moment to stretch and press closer to the divider, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Benny," Evelyn said quietly. "That'll do." And with that she was gone. Over the next day the changes were small but undeniable. Asher didn't eat at first. Not really. He tolerated the bottle. He tested the nipple without committing. But when Benny was brought back for short supervised intervals, always separated by the padded barrier, Asher's eyes followed him. His breathing steadied faster. His body temperature held. By the second evening, something finally shifted. Jordan prepared a bottle of warmed formula hands, careful like the slightest mistake might break the spell. Benny was given his own small dish nearby. He lapped enthusiastically, milk dripping from his chin-tail, wagging in wide, clumsy arcs. Asher watched. For a long moment he did nothing. Then slowly, so slowly it almost didn't count, he turned his head toward the bottle. His mouth opened just enough to test the nipple. He didn't latch. Not yet. But he didn't turn away. Mason's chest tightened. "That's it," he whispered. "Just look, just try." Benny finished his meal and flopped down beside the divider, licking his paws. Asher sniffed again. This time his mouth closed around the bottle, weak at first, then steadier. He drank. Not much, not enough to call it victory. Enough to change everything. Mason let out a laugh, quiet, broken, surprised by its own force. Lila stared at the monitor, then at Asher, then at Benny. "I've never seen this," she admitted. Mason didn't answer. He was watching Asher finish his feeding and angle his head toward Benny like he needed to confirm the warmth would still be there when he looked up. That night, Asher slept deeper than he had since arriving. Benny was returned to intake, protesting with a silent bark that shook his whole body. Asher stirred when he left eyes searching breath, hitching once before settling. But the imprint remained. When Mason dimmed the lights, he glanced once more into the incubator. For the first time, Asher wasn't facing the corner. He was facing the door. The bottle slipped from Mason's fingers and clinked softly against the metal tray. He didn't reach for it right away. Asher had stopped drinking, not abruptly, not in panic. The cub simply loosened his mouth and let the nipples slide free, as if the effort itself had become negotiable again. His eyes stayed open this time, unfocused but alert. They tracked movement in the room with a slow, searching patience that hadn't been there before. Benny was back in intake, curled into a nest of towels, exhausted from a morning of curiosity and warmth. Without him nearby, the ICU felt thinner, as though something essential had been carried out with the puppy's small body. Mason watched Asher's chest rise and fall. Still steady, still present, but waiting. "He's holding," Jordan said, reading the monitor. "For now," Mason replied. By mid-morning, the center had fully woken. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Carts rattled down hallways. The ordinary rhythm of rescue work resumed, but the ICU remained a pocket of suspended time. Dr. Lila Chen returned with fresh data, her skepticism now edged with something more complicated. "I ran the numbers again," she said, scrolling through charts on her tablet. "There's no physiological reason for his earlier refusal. Digestive function is intact. Neurological response is delayed but not impaired." Mason leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Then what are we missing?" Lila hesitated. She hated that pause. Hated how it felt like standing at the edge of something unscientific. "Stress response," she said carefully. "Acute separation trauma," Jordan added. "And environmental shock." Lila continued, then stopped herself. "But stress alone doesn't usually cause complete refusal at this age. Instinct should override." Mason looked through the glass. Asher had shifted again. His body was no longer curled tight into itself. One foreleg stretched outward now, paw resting against the incubator wall as if reaching for something that wasn't there. "Unless instinct isn't the strongest signal," Mason said. Lila frowned. "You're still pushing the attachment theory." "I'm saying he's not sick," Mason replied. "He's grieving." The word landed heavily. "Lions don't grieve like humans," Lila said. No, Mason agreed, but they do bond. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The data spoke quietly but insistently. Asher's cortisol dropped only during Benny's visits. His heart rate stabilized when the puppy was near. His alertness improved during those windows, then faded when they ended. Patterns were forming. Patterns demanded explanation. Evelyn arrived just after noon. Her presence shifted the room's gravity instantly. "How's he doing?" she asked. Mason answered honestly. "Better when Benny's here. Worse when he's not." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "We discussed limits." "We're within them," Mason said. "Short intervals, full supervision." Evelyn glanced at Lila. "Your assessment?" Lila met her eyes. "Medically, he's stable. Behaviorally." She paused. "He's responding to social stimulus." "From a dog," Evelyn said flatly. "Yes," Lila replied, "from a dog." Evelyn turned back to the glass. Asher's eyes followed her movement briefly, then drifted again toward the empty space beside the incubator. "He's looking," Evelyn murmured more to herself than anyone else. The afternoon stretched on. Asher slept, woke, accepted a few tentative swallows of formula. Each small success felt precarious, like a bridge built plank by plank over a widening gap. When Benny returned for his next visit, the change was immediate. The puppy padded in with his usual clumsiness, nails clicking softly, tail wagging with unfiltered enthusiasm. He didn't rush the incubator this time. Instead, he slowed, sensing somehow that the space required gentler movement now. He lay down beside the divider and pressed his side against it. Warmth transferred through layers of padding and air. He yawned, then settled, chin resting on his paws. Asher stirred. His head lifted slightly, neck trembling with the effort. His eyes locked onto Benny with clearer focus than before. The cub made a small sound so faint it barely registered, a breathy vibration that wasn't quite a cry. Benny's ears twitched. He couldn't hear it, but he responded anyway. His tail thumped once, then twice. Mason felt something tighten behind his ribs. "Bring the bottle," he said quietly. Jordan did. This time Mason waited until Asher's eyes were fixed on Benny before offering it. The cub hesitated, then latched on with more confidence than before. His suckling was still weak but sustained. Lila watched the monitor. "He's synchronizing," she said softly. "Heart rate, breathing." Evelyn said nothing. She stood perfectly still, watching the cub feed with the puppy at his side. When the feeding ended, Asher didn't retreat. He leaned just a fraction toward the divider head, resting against it like he was testing the boundary. Benny shifted closer, pressing his full weight against the padding. A small, solid presence. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "This isn't a solution," she said. "It's a window," Mason replied. She met his gaze. "Then use it," she said, carefully. By evening, Asher had taken 3 small feedings. Not enough to celebrate. Enough to keep the conversation alive. As the sun dipped below the desert horizon, Lila lingered after rounds. "You know what you're asking," she said to Mason. "I do. You're asking us to accept that connection might matter as much as care." Mason looked at Asher, asleep now, breathing deep and even. "I'm asking us to accept that without connection," he said, "care might not be enough." Lila studied the cub, then nodded once. "I'll keep documenting," she said. "Whatever this is, it deserves to be understood." Night fell again. Benny was carried back to intake, protesting silently, body wriggling with every ounce of resistance. Asher woke briefly when he left, eyes searching, breath hitching once, then smoothing out again. Mason stayed until the lights dimmed and the hallways quieted. He stood by the incubator, watching Asher sleep, knowing the balance they'd struck could tip at any moment. This wasn't healing, it was bargaining. And Asher, it seemed, was willing to negotiate as long as the warmth returned. The decision wasn't written down anywhere. That was the most unsettling part. There was no formal meeting, no raised voices, no signatures collected around a conference table. Instead, the choice hovered in the ICU like a subtle shift in air pressure felt before it was acknowledged, real before it was named. Everyone moved a little more carefully now, spoke a little less, as if too much certainty might scare the fragile progress away. Asher's condition held through the night. Not improved enough to celebrate, not diminished enough to intervene. His breathing stayed even. His temperature remained stable. His small body rested in a shallow sleep that suggested effort rather than collapse. Mason recognized the space immediately, the place between falling and standing where everything depended on what came next. Evelyn spent most of the morning in her office with the door closed. From the hallway, Mason could see the light under the frame, hear the faint scratch of pen on paper. Forms, reports, documentation meant to prepare for every outcome. She was doing what she had always done, building structure around uncertainty, stacking protocol against fear, like sandbags before a flood. When she finally emerged, clipboard in hand, she didn't look toward the ICU right away. 48 hours, she said, instead stopping beside Mason. "That's what I agreed to." Mason nodded. "We're halfway through, and what we have so far," Evelyn continued, "is ambiguous." "It's more than we had before," Mason replied. Evelyn met his gaze. "More doesn't mean enough." They walked together to the glass. Asher lay on his side now, one paw extended, claws barely visible. The incubator's interior light gave his coat a soft sheen, making him look almost whole, almost healthy if you didn't know what it had taken to keep him there. "He's still not eating independently," Evelyn said. "He's eating," Mason corrected, "with support. And when the support is gone..." Mason didn't answer immediately. "That's the question," he said at last. Evelyn turned away first. Lila joined them minutes later, tablet tucked under her arm, brow furrowed. "I reviewed the overnight data," she said. "The pattern's consistent." "Meaning?" Evelyn asked. "Stress markers drop when Benny's present. Spike when he leaves." Evelyn sighed. "We can't build a treatment plan around a dog." Lila hesitated. "We can build one around what works. Evelyn's expression hardened. "We can build one around what's sustainable." The word landed quietly but with force. The complication came that afternoon. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just enough to tighten every nerve in the room. During his visit, Benny grew bolder. He didn't simply lie beside the divider this time. He stood front paws braced against the padding, peering into the incubator with open curiosity. His tail wagged loose, sweeping, tapping softly against the floor. Asher reacted immediately. His head lifted higher than before, neck trembling. His eyes sharpened. His body rolled partially toward the divider, drawn by movement and warmth. For a moment it was beautiful. Then Asher's paw twitched. The motion was instinctive, no aggression, no intent. But the claws scraped faintly against the incubator wall as he reached. Benny startled not from sound, but from sudden motion. He hopped back clumsily, paws skidding. The monitor spiked. "That's enough," Mason said instantly. Jordan moved in, guiding Benny back toward the carrier. The puppy resisted, body twisting in confusion. Asher made a small sound higher this time, strained, before settling again, eyes tracking Benny until he disappeared through the door. Silence flooded the room. Evelyn had watched the entire exchange without speaking. "That," she said finally, "is exactly what I'm worried about." "Nothing happened," Mason said. "Something almost did," Evelyn replied. "And almost is how accidents begin." The rest of the day passed under a thin veil of unease. Asher's next feeding was smaller. He accepted the bottle, but his focus drifted toward the door Benny had exited through. By evening, his vitals dipped not sharply, but enough to erase the morning's gains. "This isn't caution," Mason said quietly. "This is harm. You're letting emotion override judgment." Evelyn shot back. "No," Mason said. "I'm letting observation override fear." The room went still. Lila stepped forward. "Cortisol's spiking again. Sustained levels like this can lead to organ failure." Evelyn's grip tightened on the clipboard. "Correlation," repeated, Lila replied. "Consistent." Evelyn looked at Asher. The cub lifted his head, once eyes dull, then let it fall again. He didn't cry. He didn't struggle. He simply stopped engaging. Evelyn's shoulders sagged just slightly. "We begin separation tomorrow," she said. Gradual, controlled. Mason felt the words settle like weight in his chest. "For how long?" Lila asked. "As long as it takes." And Benny Mason asked. Evelyn didn't hesitate. Back to intake. Limited contact. That night, Mason returned to the ICU alone. Asher was awake. The cub's eyes followed him as he approached, something sharper in them now. Not fear, not panic. Expectation. Asher wasn't just enduring. He was waiting. Mason rested his hand against the glass. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "We'll see how tomorrow goes." Asher blinked slowly, then turned his head toward the empty space beside the incubator. His breath caught once, then smoothed out again. Morning arrived without ceremony. No alarms, no emergency calls, just the ordinary sounds of Sonoran wildlife rescue, waking up doors, unlocking carts, rolling coffee brewing. The world behaved as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen, and that unsettled Mason more than anything else. He stood outside the ICU as Jordan prepared the transport carrier. The same carrier Benny had arrived in, cleaned, lined with fresh towels. The door propped open like an invitation that would not be honored. Inside the incubator, Asher watched. He had learned the pattern now. The puppy came. The air softened. The weight inside his chest eased. Then the door opened again, and the warmth left. His eyes tracked every movement with growing precision, mapping a sequence he feared was becoming permanent. Evelyn entered quietly, clipboard already in hand. "We start with shortened intervals," she said. 15 minutes, then none. Mason nodded, though his throat tightened. Jordan brought Benny in last. The puppy bounded forward, tail wagging, unaware anything had changed. He trotted to the divider and lay down in his usual spot, nose pressed, close breath fogging the surface. Asher reacted instantly. His head lifted higher than it had the day before. His breathing quickened, not panicked yet, but alert, engaged. For a moment, everything looked the same. Then Evelyn checked her watch. "That's enough," she said. Jordan hesitated. Now Evelyn repeated. Jordan reached for Benny, hands gentle but firm. The puppy resisted immediately, his body twisted, paws scrabbling softly against the floor, pulling back toward the incubator. He didn't bark, he couldn't, but his whole body spoke loudly enough. Asher felt it. His breathing turned shallow and uneven. He shifted forward, paused, scraping faintly as he pressed closer to the divider, eyes wide now, fixed on the retreating shape of gold. Benny was lifted, carried toward the door. Asher made a sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was thin and continuous, a strained vibration caught in the back of his throat, refusing to resolve into anything recognizable. The monitor spiked. An alarm chirped once before settling back into an uneasy rhythm. Mason stepped forward without thinking. "Wait." Evelyn raised a hand. "We agreed." The door closed. The sound Asher made stopped. It followed the puppy out, then vanished, leaving behind a silence so abrupt it felt worse than noise. Asher's body slackened, his head lowered slowly to the incubator floor. His eyes stayed open but unfocused. The room felt colder. Lila checked the monitor. Heart rate elevated. Stress responses significant. "It will normalize," Evelyn said. But it didn't. By midday, Asher refused his bottle outright. He turned his head away, mouth clamping shut with a determination that startled even Mason. When offered again, an hour later, the response was the same. "He's regressing," Jordan said quietly. "He's adjusting," Evelyn replied. "It takes time." The afternoon stretched long and airless. Asher slept little. When he did, his body twitched with restless energy. His paw remained extended toward the divider claws, flexing once, twice, as if reaching for a memory solid enough to hold. In intake, Benny lay with his chin pressed against the bars of his enclosure. Volunteers passed by, calling softly, offering toys. He ignored them all. His eyes stayed fixed in a direction he couldn't hear, but somehow knew. When the second separation interval ended, Asher's vitals dipped further. "This isn't stabilization," Lila said, voice tight. Evelyn watched the data in silence. "Continue." By evening, the truth pressed in from every side. Asher hadn't eaten since morning. His breathing had gone shallow again. His body curled inward, returning to the posture he'd worn on his first night. Days of progress unraveled in hours. Mason stood at the glass, fists clenched. "This isn't caution," he said. "It's harm." "You're letting emotion override judgment," Evelyn snapped. "No," Mason replied. "I'm letting observation override fear." Silence followed. Lila stepped forward. "Cortisol levels are spiking. Sustained at this level, we risk organ failure." Evelyn's grip tightened on the clipboard. "Correlation," repeated Lila said, consistent. Evelyn looked at Asher. The cub lifted his head, once eyes dull, then let it fall again. He didn't cry. He didn't fight. He simply stopped engaging. Evelyn's shoulders dropped just slightly. Night came early. Most of the staff left. The building settled into its nocturnal hush machines, taking over where people stepped back. Mason stayed. So did Lila. They watched the monitor trace a line that crept closer to a familiar edge. "He's doing it again," Mason said softly. "He's choosing not to stay." Lila swallowed. "If we intervene against directive—" "I'll take it," Mason said. "All of it." She studied him, then nodded once. "I'll document." The clock ticked toward midnight. Asher's breathing grew shallower. Mason reached for the radio. "Jordan," he said quietly, "I need you." A pause. "Then I'm here." "Bring Benny," Mason said. "Now." The line went silent. Mason returned to the glass and rested his palm against it. "Just a little longer," he whispered. "Hold on." Asher didn't respond. But somewhere down the corridor, a carrier door opened. The hallway lights were dimmed to their lowest setting, the kind of half-light meant to discourage movement rather than invite it. At 2:41 a.m., Sonoran Wildlife Rescue existed in fragments. Closed doors, sleeping monitors, the soft tick of a wall clock counting time. No one wanted to acknowledge. Mason moved through the corridor quietly. Steps measured, breath controlled, as if the building itself might object if he rushed. Jordan was already in intake when Mason arrived. He stood beside Benny's enclosure, one hand resting on the latch, the other clenched at his side. The puppy pressed forward the moment he saw Mason's tail whipping against the bars, his entire body vibrating with recognition that needed no sound. Jordan didn't smile. "You're sure?" he asked. Mason nodded once. "I am." Jordan opened the door. Benny tumbled out, paws skidding on the polished floor. He didn't hesitate. His nose dropped low, tracking a path he had never walked at night, moving faster than Mason expected, as if guided by something older than training. An internal compass tuned to warmth, to absence, to the place where something was waiting. They didn't take the main corridor. Mason led them through the service passage, past storage rooms and darkened labs. keys stayed silent in his pocket. The ICU door loomed ahead dim except for the glow bleeding beneath it. Mason paused with his hand on the handle. Once inside, there would be no pretending this was protocol. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The monitor told the story before Mason reached the incubator. Asher's line moved too slowly, too shallow. Life reduced to minimal effort. The cub lay curled inward, face turned toward the corner again, eyes half-lidded and distant. Mason moved quickly but calmly, checking the divider, adjusting the barrier to its safest configuration. Jordan set Benny down beside it, hands lingering a fraction longer than necessary. Benny didn't hesitate. He crossed the short distance and lay down, pressing his side against the padding nose inches from where Asher's head rested. He exhaled a soft rush of breath that fogged the divider. Asher reacted instantly. His head lifted weak but determined. His eyes opened fully this time. Pupils widened as they locked onto the familiar shape. His breathing hitched once sharp, startled, then smoothed as recognition settled in. Benny licked the barrier. Asher pushed himself forward, paws scraping faintly, claws catching against the textured surface as he reached. His body trembled with the effort strength draining in invisible waves. But he didn't stop. The monitor jumped. Mason felt it in his chest before he saw it on the screen. Heart rate climbed not into panic but into presence. Breathing deepened, pulling air into places that had gone neglected for hours. "That's it," Mason whispered. "That's it." Benny shifted closer, pressing his full weight against the divider. He placed his chin down, eyes half closed, offering stillness instead of stimulation. Asher leaned into it. His forehead touched the padding. He stayed there, breathing, anchored. The sound he made was barely audible, a low, vibrating exhale hovering between relief and exhaustion. Mason stepped back, hands shaking now that he no longer needed them to be steady. Jordan wiped his face with the heel of his palm. "He's coming back," he murmured. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Asher didn't retreat. He stayed. When Mason offered the bottle again, he waited until Asher's eyes flicked to Benny first. The cub latched on with surprising urgency. He drank more than he had all day. Milk dribbled from the corner of his mouth, darkening the fur beneath his chin, but he didn't let go until the bottle was empty. Benny watched tail thumping softly, steady sure. When the feeding ended, Asher relaxed into a shape Mason hadn't seen since the first night, extended, open-angled toward the divider. His head rested against it. Sleep followed quickly. Mason sank into the chair beside the incubator. That was when the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic. They slid down his face, unchecked, the kind that arrived when a long-held line finally snapped. "I thought I'd learned how to live with it," Mason said quietly. With being told loss was necessary, that some things just couldn't be saved. Jordan stayed silent, giving him space. Mason looked at Asher, then at Benny. "I won't do it again," he said softly. "Not if I can help it." The door opened behind them. Mason stiffened. Dr. Lila Chen stepped inside, hair pulled back hastily, tablet clutched to her chest. She took in the scene, the puppy, the divider, the monitor's steady rhythm in a single glance. She didn't speak. She went straight to the screen. Her fingers moved quickly, pulling up overlays, timestamps, comparisons. "This..." She stopped, tried again. "This is definitive." She looked at Mason, eyes bright with something close to awe. "When they're together, his stress response doesn't diminish," she said. "It collapses." And when separated, Mason asked. Lila swallowed. "We were killing him." Footsteps approached in the hallway. Measured. Familiar. The door opened again. Evelyn Hart stood in the doorway, framed by dim light. Her eyes moved from Benny to Asher to the monitor. She didn't ask how they got there. She walked to the glass. For a long moment she said nothing. Asher shifted in his sleep paw, sliding closer to the divider. Benny adjusted, instinctively pressing in. "Show me the data," Evelyn said quietly. Lila handed over the tablet. Evelyn studied the graphs, cortisol levels, heart rate variability, feeding intervals. The story was written in lines and curves impossible to argue with. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "My daughter," she said suddenly. "When she was sick, everyone told me love was dangerous, that hope would only make it worse." She looked back at Asher. "I believed them." No one spoke. "We can't go back to separation," Evelyn said at last. "Not like that." Relief hit Mason sharp and disorienting. But Evelyn continued, "This can't continue the way it is." Lila nodded. "We need a new plan." Evelyn straightened. a specialized enclosure, safe zones, controlled growth, full oversight. Mason met her gaze, and Evelyn looked at the puppy, then at the cub whose breathing now filled the room with quiet certainty. For now, she said, he stays. Outside, the desert wind paused. Inside, two lives settled into the first real sleep they'd shared in days. For the first time since Asher arrived, the monitor traced a line that looked like something worth protecting. Morning didn't bring resolution. It brought reality. Asher grew not dramatically, at first not in a way that invited celebration, but steadily, unmistakably, the way bodies do once they decide to stay. His legs lengthened, his shoulders broadened. The fragile stillness that once defined him gave way to movement that carried intention. The ICU could no longer contain him, nor should it. Healing, after all, wasn't meant to happen behind glass forever. 3 days after the night everything changed, the transition began. It was a careful choreography. Panels reinforced, floors padded, elevated platforms installed at varying heights, some accessible to Benny, others deliberately not. Visual barriers placed where space, not force, would guide behavior. Dr. Lila Chen supervised every adjustment tablet never far from her hand-eyes, sharp with a focus that bordered on reverence. Evelyn approved each modification in stages, her decisiveness softened by a new attentiveness she hadn't known she possessed. Mason watched from the threshold as Asher took his first steps into the temporary holding enclosure. The cub paused, nostrils flaring as he tested the unfamiliar air. Sunlight filtered in through reinforced mesh dust motes, drifting lazily through the beam. It smelled different out here, less sterile, more honest. Asher hesitated. Then he looked back, not at the handlers, not at the open space, at Benny. The puppy trotted forward, tail wagging, entirely unbothered by the size difference that had begun to matter to everyone else. He stepped into the enclosure and sat down as if to say, "I'm here. That's enough." Asher followed. The days that came after were quieter than anyone expected. No dramatic incidents, no viral moments begging to be recorded. Instead, there was observation, adaptation, a slow recalibration unfolding in gestures too subtle for headlines but too precise to ignore. Asher learned his strength not because he was taught, but because he noticed. When play grew too rough, when a paw landed heavier than intended, he stopped, froze. His eyes flicked to Benny's face, reading a language that had nothing to do with sound. Benny responded without fear. Sometimes he stepped back, sometimes he stayed close. Always he communicated through posture and presence. Lila documented everything. "He's self-regulating," she said one afternoon, watching from the observation deck. "That's not conditioning." Evelyn folded her arms, or restraint. "There's a difference," Lila replied. "Restraint is imposed. This is chosen." The distinction settled quietly, but it mattered. Weeks passed. Asher's diet expanded. Enrichment routines were introduced, scent trails, controlled challenges, simulated prey, designed to engage instinct without danger. Benny watched from his platform's head-tilted body still. Sometimes he joined in batting at hanging toys or chasing shadows with a seriousness that made the staff smile despite themselves. And then one afternoon, something happened that erased every lingering doubt. It was a mistake. A new staff member failed to secure an enrichment gate properly. A small live prey item, a rabbit meant for a separate enclosure, found its way through an unsecured barrier and into Asher's space. Mason saw it first. The rabbit froze near the water basin, ears twitching, body tight with instinctive fear. Asher noticed immediately. His posture changed. Spine straightened. Muscles tightened, eyes narrowed with a focus older than memory. The air shifted. Benny was nearby, climbing down from one of his platforms, unaware of what was unfolding behind him. He landed lightly and trotted toward Asher, stopping just short of the lion's shoulder. The rabbit darted. Benny moved, stepping forward, not in defense, not in challenge, but simply into Asher's line of sight. He looked up, head tilted, eyes calm. Asher stopped, not hesitated, stopped. His muscles remained coiled, breath controlled. His eyes tracked the rabbit's escape path for a fraction of a second longer. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned away. He walked past Benny, past the water basin, and lay down in the shade near their shared resting place. The rabbit vanished through the far opening unharmed. The observation deck fell silent. Lila's hand hovered over her tablet, forgotten. Evelyn's breath caught audibly. Mason felt his knees weaken as understanding hit him all at once. Asher hadn't failed to hunt. He had chosen not to. "That's not suppression," Lila whispered. "That's prioritization." Evelyn couldn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the lion now resting beside the dog. One massive paw draped loosely across Benny's back, a gesture so familiar it was easy to forget how impossible it once seemed. From that day on, the conversations changed. They were no longer about whether the bond was real. They were about what responsibility it created. A permanent enclosure was approved, larger, more complex, designed to grow with Asher while preserving spaces where Benny could always be safe. Elevated tunnels, reinforced retreats, visual barriers that allowed choice rather than forced distance. Evelyn signed off on every blueprint herself. One evening, long after the staff had gone home, she found Mason on the observation deck. "You know," she said quietly, "when my daughter was sick, I thought love was something you endured until it hurt too much to hold." Mason didn't interrupt. "I spent years building rules so no one would ever feel what I felt," she continued. "But watching them," she gestured toward the enclosure, "I think I confused prevention with protection." Mason nodded. "They're not the same." Below them, Benny circled once before lying down. Asher mirrored the movement without thinking, settling close enough that their sides touched. The lion's breathing deepened. Evelyn watched until they were still. "Some instincts," she said softly, "are stronger than hunger." Mason kept his eyes on the enclosure. "Some choices are stronger than instinct." Time did what it always does when no one is watching. It layered itself quietly over the days, softening sharp edges, deepening what had already taken root. By the time Asher reached his first birthday, the change was undeniable. His body had filled into the shape the world expected of him. Broad chest, powerful shoulders, a mane beginning to gather along his neck like a promise. When he moved now, the ground seemed to listen. Staff learned to feel his presence before they saw him, an awareness that settled into the air like gravity. Benny aged differently. His muzzle lightened, first silver, threading through gold. His steps slowed not from weakness but from a patience earned by living without sound. He still climbed the platforms every morning, though more carefully now, pausing halfway to glance back, as if checking whether Asher was watching. Asher always was. The permanent enclosure became the quiet center of Sonoran wildlife rescue. Visitors came and learned to lower their voices. Staff passed through and learned to linger. The space itself taught restraint. Elevated walkways Benny used that Asher never attempted. Shaded hollows Asher preferred when the heat rose. Shared ground worn smooth by years of synchronized rest. Dr. Lila Chen's documentation grew into something larger than she'd planned. Papers became presentations. Presentations became invitations. Conferences asked her to explain what she called cross-species regulatory bonding. She showed graphs, cortisol curves flattening when two heartbeats aligned behavioral footage that refused to fit inside neat theoretical boxes. She never sensationalized it. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke in a language older than theory. Evelyn funded a small research wing with her own money. She named it quietly without ceremony after her daughter. There was no press release. The name existed for those who needed it. Mason stepped back from night shifts, not because the work mattered less, but because it finally mattered in a way that allowed him to rest. He still came every week, notebook in hand, documenting the ordinary miracles most people missed. The way Asher angled his body away while eating, how Benny read tension before it arrived. The ritual they shared at dusk, Benny circling once, Asher answering with a slow blink. When the offers came, no one was surprised. Zoos, sanctuaries, research facilities with resources Sonoran could only imagine. Each letter promised the same thing: proper lion companionship, expanded territory, the chance for Asher to be what he was meant to be. Evelyn gathered the team and spread the letters across the conference table. "What happens if we accept?" she asked. Lila answered first. "Based on everything we've documented, separation would cause severe distress, potentially fatal." "And if we don't?" Evelyn asked. Mason looked at the papers, then out the window toward the enclosure. "Then we accept that proper doesn't always mean right." The decision was unanimous. Every offer was declined. The announcement brought attention, media donations, volunteers from across the country. The center grew. Other animals arrived with histories that didn't fit clean narratives, bonds that required patience instead of certainty. None carried the same gravity as the first two. None needed to. Years later, Mason stood on the observation deck as the sun sank into the desert, painting the sky in amber and rose. Asher lay near the water's edge, massive now, mane catching the light. Benny rested against his side, smaller, with each passing season breath, steady eyes half closed. A chicken escaped from enrichment wandered near the far fence. Mason's breath caught out of old habit. Asher noticed. His head lifted, his posture sharpened. Benny shifted, stepping closer, not blocking, not guarding, just there. A silent exchange passed between them. Too subtle for cameras, too complete for explanation. Asher turned away. The chicken pecked at the dirt, unaware of the choice that had spared it. Mason smiled, not with triumph, but with recognition. Later that night, Benny struggled to climb his platform. His paws slipped. He tried again, then paused, panting softly. Asher rose immediately and positioned himself beneath, becoming a living ramp of muscle and patience. Benny climbed across his back and reached the platform tail, wagging once in quiet thanks. Asher settled below. They slept that way. When Benny passed the following winter, it was gentle, quiet. Asher stayed with him until the end, massive head pressed close, breathing steady and sure. In the days after, Asher carried on. He ate, he moved, he lived. But each night he returned to the same place, resting his paw where warmth used to be, eyes soft with memory. Grief did not break him. It transformed him. Years later, children would stand at the glass and ask why the lion slept alone. Guides would explain carefully, kindly, leaving room for wonder. Some things didn't need instruction. Mason retired soon after. On his last visit, he stood once more on the observation deck, watching Asher beneath a sky that never tired of telling stories. He thought of a night long ago, a monitor line faltering, a puppy who couldn't hear fear, a cub who needed one reason to stay. He had found it, and in doing so had taught everyone watching that sometimes survival isn't about strength, instinct, or even love. Sometimes it's about choosing again and again to remain. This story reminds us that survival is not always driven by instinct alone. Emotional connection, safety, and companionship can be as vital as food and medicine, especially in early development and trauma recovery. Across species-regulated social bonds, reduce stress, stabilize behavior, and support healing. The lesson is clear. Compassion is not a weakness in science or conservation. When care includes empathy, observation, and humility, it can unlock outcomes that rigid rules alone may never achieve.